We should also extend our gratitude to our host here today, Americans for Peace, Prosperity, and Security. Through fora like these, they deliver insight and understanding on a range of global issues that don't really lend themselves to hashtags or bumper stickers. And so it is through fora like these that they're hosting in a lot of the early primary states that voters will have an opportunity to learn where these candidates really come down. And so before we go much further in the program, I'd like to invite you to please stand with me and join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. We're thrilled y'all are here.
Good afternoon. I'm John Hoffman. I'm the State Director for Americans for Peace, Prosperity, and Security. And before we get going here, I want to thank Wes for that introduction. Also thank Winthrop for hosting us here in this great facility. But right now we're going to hear from our national chairman, former House Intel Chairman Mike Rogers.
Hello, I'm Mike Rogers, former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Pleased to kick off another Americans for Peace, Prosperity, and Security Forum in South Carolina. The mission of APS is to drive presidential candidates beyond rhetoric and talking points, raise the level of debate on critical national security issues. I want to welcome our guest today, former Governor Jeb Bush. Jeb is a successful former governor and businessman who cared deeply about America's place in the world. The South Carolina Advisory Board and I thought he'd be an excellent guest for today's event. I'd also like to thank our moderator, Gene Meserve, for agreeing to join us today. Gene is a former anchor and correspondent for CNN and ABC News. She's covered intelligence, cyber, and border security issues. We're fortunate to have you leading our discussion. Thank you, Gene. And thank you again, Governor Bush, the APS South Carolina leadership team, and our guests for what I hope will be a meaningful, in-depth conversation on the critical security issues facing our great nation. Have a great event this morning. God bless, and let's make some news, Governor Bush.
So today's event is our 5th in South Carolina and our 13th nationwide. We have chapters in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, as well as Michigan, hosting these with as many candidates as we can have. Governor Bush was kind enough to join us in Iowa a few weeks ago, and this is going to be his second effort with us, and we're really looking forward to hear from him. As the chairman mentioned, Gene Meserve from CNN, a former anchor for CNN, 20 years, including covering 9/11, Katrina, and a number of different issues. Cyber, terrorism, national security issues, homeland security issues. Also is at the State Department, where she was the ABC correspondent, so she covered Middle East, Russia, China. So I'm sure she'll have some good questions on those topics today. I don't really need to introduce the governor, the 43rd governor of Florida. If you guys didn't know who he was, you probably wouldn't be here. But we're very excited to have Governor Bush here. I had the opportunity to see him speak in Germany this summer on many of the same issues, and it was a great conversation on national security issues and foreign policy. And we're expecting to see a lot of the same today. So please join me in welcoming Governor Bush and Gene Meserve to the stage.
As a reporter, I used to come to South Carolina to cover hurricanes and political campaigns, both news events that involve a lot of wind. But today, we're going to try and generate a little light. Governor, thanks so much for joining us.
You bet.
I want to start by asking you about the news of the day. 2 women graduating from Ranger School. So what happens now? Should women go into combat?
Absolutely. If the Rangers, they're clearly qualified. These decisions ought to be made by the military, not by the political side of life in Washington D.C. But if you're Ranger ready, you're combat ready, and that's an extraordinary feat for these 2 women that are graduating. I think it's something everybody should be really proud of.
There are some people who say maybe it's not the place for women, in part because of the esprit de corps amongst men who fight together, the band of brothers effect, as it were.
I think the morale of the troops is really important. The fact that but in the modern world, I think you can make these accommodations. But I would listen to the leaders of the military first and foremost. I wouldn't try to impose a political agenda on them for anything. The first priority is the morale of the troops, and are they ready? Are they trained? Do they have the equipment necessary to do their jobs? If they have all that, they'll do it extraordinarily well. We have the greatest fighting force in the world. It's under duress right now, under threat because of sequester. That's a bigger issue, I think, than whether 2 qualified women are going to be in combat.
Perfect segue into the issue of military.
Did I say something first? I want to thank our host at Winthrop University for hosting this. Welcome the students back next week, but thank you very much for allowing us to come.
So on that issue, military spending, you said that we should be spending more. How much? Put a number on it.
Well, I think that Senator McCain's efforts to use this supplemental funding to enhance the military is the appropriate thing to do. I think the better way to do it is to create a strategy, determine what the force level ought to be, what we need to have to be secure, and then fund that. This is the first priority, both in terms of our intelligence capability and military capability. If we asked our government to do one thing, it would be this, I think. And right now we've seen dramatic reductions. If we continue on this path of sequester, we'll get down to an army that will be smaller than it was prior to World War II. I liked what General Odierno said on his last day of service, an extraordinary career, where he said that, I think he said that 490,000 is the proper level perhaps, and we're moving down to 450 with the possibility of getting down to 422,000 in the Army. And we see similar reductions in the Navy, Marines, and Air Force as well. Now, that doesn't mean, so spending is not the only measurement, because I think the Defense Department spends really inefficiently as well. Just as it does in other parts of the government, our inabilities to procure, mired in just massive bureaucracy around the procurement process, whether it's information technology or procurement for big weapon systems, it takes way too long and it's way too expensive. I think the military is way too top-heavy as well. So you can reform it, but I think that this should be the first priority, and we ought to invest in the military to make sure our troops are ready, that they're trained, and that they have the best equipment possible to keep us safe.
Will create enough savings to fund the increases you're talking about?
No.
We're talking about taking money from somewhere else, and where do we take it from?
Well, we take it from every other aspect of government, number one, but we have to grow our economy at a far faster rate. This argument. Yeah, let me give you the part of this that people kind of ignore. We're living in a world where the new normal is 2% growth. Mike Mullen said it best, I think, that our budget deficit is perhaps our greatest national security threat. The solution to that is not higher taxes. The solution, first and foremost, is high sustained economic growth, where more people have a chance at earned success. If we were growing at 3.5% or 4% rather than this new normal of 1.5% or 2%, the demands on government would subside. That's a savings. If less people are dependent upon government, you have significant savings. And if we're growing, no amount of exotic form of taxation, and the candidate that suggests that we should tax assets, I won't say who it is, but those kind of ideas, those are exotic forms of taxation, or raising taxes in all sorts of different ways. You'll never get close to the revenue generated for government by high sustained economic growth. So first and foremost, grow the economy at a faster rate over a sustained period of time. We'll have ample revenue to be able to deal with the first priority. And then challenge everything that goes on. I mean, we just have to accept the fact that the Veterans Department has a $1.8 billion hospital that was originally started at $300 million, then went to, the mission changed and went to $800 million. Now it's $1.7 billion. We just have to accept this. We have to accept it takes $800 million to set up a stinking website for healthcare.gov. I mean, bringing competency into the process of government, it's not how to do it.
It's a big, long process, I think. I want to remind you all that we are going to take audience questions. If you could write your questions on the index cards, there are people in the audience who will pick them up. Please make them legible, put your names on them so I can then ask them of the governor. I want to switch, if we could, to Syria. You have talked about an effort to strengthen forces there.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about this, what you're talking about, because we've just read news stories that 54 moderate Syrian forces have been trained at a cost of $41 million. And then they went into Syria and several of them were captured by al-Nusra. So,
Yeah, so but the amount appropriated is $500 million for this effort, and now it's being reevaluated. First and foremost, this has to be a long-haul process. We have to be patient and resolved and engaged in this effort, both in Iraq and in Syria. If we're serious about taking out ISIS, which I think should be a high priority for this country, they're a real threat to the national security of our country. We can't just say it's the JV team and leave it at that. Every day that this caliphate stays in existence, it garners energy, it recruits people. We saw the story, at least this morning I saw a story of 2 teenagers from London that arrived in Syria through Turkey, model students, totally a huge surprise to their families. This recruiting effort exists because they say they win when they exist. I mean, literally, it's a victory every day. They send out thousands and thousands of emails to recruit people. It's a danger for homegrown terrorists in our country. So if it's serious, then you need to develop a strategy. And as it relates to Syria, I think you have to create a no-fly zone to be
we have talked about more than that. You've talked
talked
about
about-
multiple safe zones.
multiple safe zones as well. And we need to create an alternative to the radical Islamic Sunni terrorism and the brutality of the Assad regime supported by Iran and Hezbollah.
Won't it take a sustained U.S. military effort to create and hold those safe zones?
It will take a partnership where the United States provides leadership in terms of equipment, training, air support, but we can't do this alone.
Will we send troops?
I think we have special forces there.
More? You want more?
I want to win. I want to take them out. So I will take, let's put it I'm not commander in chief yet, you know, to be kind of hard, I get classified, and I am working hard at it, and I tend to be. And we'll have a strategy from day one on this, but the troop levels, in terms of our assistance, the point I want to make is that it requires the cooperation of the Turks, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, all of them have been playing a role in Syria, sometimes in contradiction to one another. If we're going to lead, we need to create a united front of moderate Syrian, led by moderate Syrians, but supported by the region. We can't do this alone. We can't be the world's policeman. What happens if we did that? If we came in, we could take, militarily, we have the capability of doing this, but immediately, the chaos that would ensue would create another void, just as it's done historically. Libya is a good example of this. This administration doesn't have a strategy, they're incremental in their approach, and the net result is that we have chaos. You don't call someone the JV team and then allow them to create a caliphate. You don't say that there's a red line and then not have any consequence when the red line is crossed. You don't promise support to the Syrian Free Army 3-4 years ago, which would have had a dramatic impact, and then allow it to go away when we didn't provide support. We have to have a clear strategy. It has to be expressed publicly, and we need to do this in cooperation with our allies.
Well, you understand some of the concern. The thought of putting more U.S. troops on the ground in the Middle East doesn't sit well with some Americans.
Absolutely it doesn't. It doesn't, I get that. But this is a direct threat to our national security interests. And presidents have to lead. They can't mirror whatever what's popular at the time. I'll tell you what.
What's the end game?
The end game is to take ISIS out, and in the case of Syria.
What happens in Syria?
What happens in Syria, which is actually kind of before you cut me off. You have to have a united, Sunni-driven alternative to Assad that respects minority, the diverse nature of Syria. You have to create stability. You can't afford our taxes and regulations, but I don't think this is necessarily a political effort. This is a challenge because export-led growth is starting to stall out.
Let me ask you another China question. China's gotten very active all around the world. It's forming relationships with countries in Africa,
Yep.
South America, doing a lot of infrastructure investment, extracting a lot of natural resources. How are you concerned? How concerned are you? And how do you counter this?
Well, our relationships with countries can be broader and deeper and more respectful of them. The Chinese relationship is mercantilist. It's basically to extract their minerals. Many of these huge projects, they bring in Chinese labor. The economic impacts of this are not nearly as profound as promised. So I think if we get in the game,
Well, we're not a player.
that's right. If we get in the game, particularly in Latin America, where we have strong relationships, my experience, and I have quite a bit of experience as it relates to Latin America, there's a yearning for the United States, both in terms of our diplomatic efforts, but more importantly, our economic efforts to be a partner in Latin America. There's natural ties there that far exceed what China benefits. Now, China's going to face a problem. When you subsidize Venezuela to the extent they have, to the tune of $40 billion of debt that they're secured by forward oil exports from Venezuela to China, the net result is Venezuela is about ready to default on its debt. It's a totally bankrupt, corrupt, socialist failure. They're going to have to pay that price. The next government that hopefully comes in to restore democracy and restore free market economics, they should not have that burden because China has protected the Chavez and Maduro regimes, and so they're going to be paying a price for the heavy-handed nature of their support of dictatorships.
Question from Mike in the audience. Is NATO up for the challenge with Russia?
So a couple of months ago, I went to Germany, Poland, and Estonia, and the answer to that is yes, but we've got to lead. If Europe is not going to do what they need to do, which is for countries to get over 2% of their GDP in defense, if they see us gutting our defense and moving downward, number one. Number two, I think we have to be the leader in this regard. Germany is much more cautious about this than other countries, but Germany dominates the EU and it's a huge player in NATO. So when the further east you go, the more desirous the countries are of having a presence. It doesn't have to be a massive presence, but it has to be more than a symbolic presence of American troops, American equipment in Poland and in the Baltics. We need to send a pretty clear signal that Putin's adventurism, there's a price to pay. And I think that this is where the cooperation with Europe is hugely important. If we play our part and they respond, I think a forward statement of what the penalties are for Putin's continued bad behavior, where he has to underwrite the risks. In effect, you want to be able to send a signal to this guy that the consequences of further, Moldova, Ukraine, threatening the Baltics with what they call the little green men. They take off the emblems of their Russian army emblems and destabilize where there is a lot of Russian-speaking people, that there's a consequence, and the consequence has to be greater than the benefits that he perceives.
Sanctions are in place.
They are, but you can do a lot more. You can do a lot more, and I think rather than reacting to the bad behavior, I think we need to be more forward-leaning as it relates to what the consequences will be. And we ought to be arming the Ukraine army. We ought to be providing them defensive weapons. We ought to be helping them, NATO should, with training.
But does that provoke Putin if you do that?
Yeah, so, history is full of examples of appeasement and pulling back, creating greater risk than standing up for your friends and allies. We have a treaty obligation in NATO that any country that's attacked, the rest of the alliance has to come to their defense. And if we send the signal, well, gosh, we're going to provoke Putin, then it sends a pretty chilling signal to our NATO allies that we're not serious about maintaining a commitment that has kept Europe secure in the post-World War II era. So I would argue, it's not being bellicose to say what you'll do if someone acts in a way that creates a threat to your allies. That's not warmongering. This whole argument that somehow standing up based on principle, for freedom and standing up for your friends is creating a more dangerous world, I would argue the exact opposite. As we pull back, we've seen what happens, and it is a more dangerous world than the day that Barack Obama got elected president, Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. This is the problem. This argument, the nuanced approach consistently is somehow one, that creates more security. I think there's too many examples that suggest otherwise.
You suggest if we leave, Europe will step up. Will they? They've got their own economic problems. Do they really want to pump any more money into military stuff?
Based on the conversations I had, Germany is committed to it in their budget.
What about England?
England,
They're way down.
they are down. I'm not sure about England, about the UK. Poland's committed to it. Germany, Poland, and look, we just need to make the case that this is a high priority. As these risks increase, I think there's growing awareness of the importance of protecting their homeland. This is a new Russia. This is a Russia that is emboldened. When I was there, every day there was another act that would have been, had it been near the United States, a huge act of provocation. Russian pilots flying by commercial aircraft, a Russian vessel while we were in Poland telling a Swedish vessel that was laying cable to bring energy from Sweden, electricity from Sweden to Lithuania, telling them to leave the premises. This was international waters. Cybersecurity attacks in Estonia. And you go and you listen to people talk, and there's clear threats. This is not this kind of idle threats. These are serious threats that we have to engage with Russia in a serious way to push them back in that regard.
Emily asked the question, what's your view on the United Nations? Are they relevant?
Well, I have mixed feelings about the United Nations. I'm sure there are things that are important. There's roles that where our participation through the United Nations is helpful. But in general, outsourcing our foreign policy to international organizations is not where I stand. I just think we can be more productive. This whole notion that we're part of the community of nations, this new language really kind of just drives me bonkers. We have to lead. We have to be the country that stands for things and that creates the order that is created by our leadership. It protects us. If we just become another UN vote, there'll be chaos in the world. And so there is a legitimate role for the United Nations, but it needs to be limited. And our foreign policy ought to be ours.
Are you talking about becoming the world's policeman to an even later degree? You're talking about, greater presence in Europe, particularly in Ukraine. You're talking about greater presence in the Middle East.
So
we're getting more deeply enmeshed in problems that some of which aren't perhaps a direct threat to the United States.
I think the Ukraine issue is a threat, a serious threat to the United States and certainly to Europe. We have to do this in partnership. This is the argument that the president gives all the time is, if you don't agree with my really sophisticated, nuanced approach, as it relates to Iran, for example, or name your favorite foreign policy challenge, then you're a warmonger. I mean, basically, this is his argument. It's a straw man argument. I would argue the opposite, that if we lead and we do it in partnership with our allies, that will create a safer world that will lessen the chance or the need for us to engage militarily in a direct fashion. The leadership doesn't necessarily mean the impulse is to have the United States Marines and Special Forces and Army on the ground immediately. That's not what leadership is. It's sending a clear, consistent signal to our friends that we have their back, that we're in it for the long haul. We accept the responsibility of leadership because it's in our national security interest to do so, and that our friends know that so that they don't change their behaviors and that they're committed to doing their part for their own security, and our enemies fear us a little bit. I mean, look at the world when we pull back. Look at the grandiosity of language, the red line probably being the best example. We're calling ISIS the JV team. When you send that signal and then you don't act, the rest of the world watches. It's not just in that particular instance that it changes things, but China is now much more emboldened than it ever was because they don't think the United States is serious in maintaining the alliances in Asia. The big pivot, the big talk of a pivot, and what do we end up sending? Less than 100 troops to Perth. I mean, come on. We should limit the talk and be serious about our actions, and that's not boots on the ground in every case. This is not a military option in every case. We need to be a leader.
But you are talking tough. So is your philosophy talk tough and carry a big stick?
Talk less and carry a big stick.
Talk less? message. In other
It
words,
does.
half of your
Yeah,
message, that's
Clearly it does, and you need to back it up. The more important part is the backing up part. If there's a certainty of that, you're going to change behavior. And your friends will know that that you have their back, and our enemies will respond in kind. Look, do you think that the Persian Gulf countries with this Iranian agreement are just going to say, oh, I guess you're right, the Iranians, even though they're the largest sponsor of terrorism, state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and even though they are organized to try to destabilize our regimes, as imperfect as our regimes are, I guess you're right, we'll just go along with this? Or are they going to now build up a military capability and perhaps create an environment where there's going to be proliferation of nuclear weapons? That's the challenge here, is that when we pull back, people have to they view these things as an existential threat. Israel does as well. And so our actions create insecurity amongst our friends and allies, and they respond accordingly.
So the accord with Iran, you don't believe it's a good deal.
Right.
So what do you do about curbing the possibility of Iran developing a nuclear weapon? What's your alternative?
Well, my alternative would be the Congress that with a veto-proof majority kills this deal and then sends signals to the administration of what the context of the deal should look like, which should have been the deal that the president announced, the objectives that he announced 3 or 4 years ago. Now he's now said, well, that was yesterday. Today, now we have all these safeguards. Well, the safeguards aren't in place. So, at a minimum, the next president needs to have a strategy to be vigilant as it relates to their capabilities they're now a nuclear threshold country. We've given them that status. We legitimize that. So now we have to use every tool in the toolkit to make sure that these weak verification elements are enhanced in every way.
If we
Number one.
settle this deal, do you think they'll go back to the table again?
Yeah, I do. If we can keep the sanctions in place. Had we kept the
It's a
sanctions,
big if.
it is, but had we kept the sanctions in place, $45 barrel of oil would have devastated. They would have accepted a significantly different deal. Nothing in this agreement, by the way, has anything to do with the immediate threats that Iran brings to the world, which is their direct support of terrorism through Hezbollah, through in Yemen, through Hamas now back in the game as it relates to the Gaza. All of these elements, Sunni militia directly in Iraq, all of these Shia militia, all of these threats have nothing to do with the agreement. And now they're emboldened with $100 billion plus to be able to carry out their will. Mullahs don't go quietly into the night. The idea that you're going to change their behavior by giving them everything they want and getting nothing in return to speak of, I think is the wrong approach, and I think the deal should be killed.
However, you have military, scientists saying it's not a bad deal. We should go for it.
I disagree with that. I don't think it's verifiable, and it doesn't deal with the other threats, the conventional weapons capability they'll now have with the lifting of sanctions, the ballistic missile capability that they're building of complying with previous agreements. None. I mean, they violated that bill.
Verification built in, and some people say
It's anytime, anywhere, any place? No. I mean, this is the whole point. This is trust but verify. I mean, this is the whole, a regime of verification is essential. And it was promised. Take it to the bank. It's guaranteed that we'll do this. And now, I mean, if you talk to the same people that you're suggesting are supportive of this deal, they can't make a compelling case that this is verifiable.
Are we going to leave it to the Israelis to take care of these Iranian nuclear problems?
Look, I can't speculate about that. I do think that we need to provide more support for Israel today because of this agreement. This is an existential threat. I mean, I try to think about this by putting myself in the shoes of our friends. You're a tiny nation. You have a country that with great regularity says not only death to America, same people that we're negotiating with and making concessions to, but death to Israel. I have to take them at their word that they're serious about this. It's not some kind of rhetorical flourish in the streets of Tehran. That this is serious, and if you from the perspective of Israel, it seems to me that this is an existential threat. This is not some kind of minor issue to deal with. We ought to provide intelligence capabilities, the most sophisticated weapon systems possible for Israel to defend its interests for sure.
Even if it includes a military strike on Iran against nuclear facility?
The military option for the United States should never be taken off the table.
I want to switch to some more audience questions here. After you are elected, what will be required of citizens to sacrifice for the benefit of the nation as this time?
Well, look, we've got less than the sacrifice. Right now, citizens are sacrificing big time. 6 million more people in poverty than the day that Barack Obama got elected president. Median income that's in decline in the first time in the recovery. There are more small businesses closing than starting. It's never existed in American history. I don't think it's time to say we want more of this. What we need to do is to reform the things that impede people's ability to rise up. And the biggest priority, we're not talking foreign policy is hugely important, national defense is hugely important, but we would be far more able and agile as it relates to foreign policy and strengthening our intelligence and military capabilities if we're growing our economy. So I'm not one for saying more sacrifice. I'm saying we ought to have a zeal for reform. There should be no tolerance for the kind of ineptitude that exists and the sheer incompetence that exists in Washington. Its ability to procure lifetime employment, all the things that most enterprises have transformed themselves using information technology effectively, dealing with our entitlement challenges. I mean, it made sense in 1934 to have a supplemental retirement system that had, when life expectancy was 64, that says that you started getting your retirement benefits when you were 65. That was not a radical idea. That was actually a sound, underwritten kind of proposal. Well, the world's changed, and we've made some modifications on Social Security, but we're going to have to do more. We have to have the courage to start fixing these antiquated systems that were designed for the mid-20th century that no longer are relevant in the 21st century. And I have the experience to do that, by the way. It's not something I just talk about. I got to be governor of a state that, when I finished, we had fewer government workers, but 1.3 million new jobs, more than any state other than one, California state, 2.5 times our size. We cut taxes rather than raise taxes. We reformed our child welfare system. We did all these things, and we created a high-growth strategy, which needs to be what the United States now has. Sorry to slip into the other side of policy life, but they go together. This is where Mullen's correct, that our national security is imperiled by our inability to deal with our structural deficit problems.
Well, Rick has a question. If you're elected president, what changes would you support for active duty and retired personnel benefits?
I think what we need to do is to, first of all, we need to have fewer people retiring from the military. This idea, we have the veterans, I laid out some reforms for the Veterans Administration that will be overwhelmed by the downsizing of the military. And so, first and foremost, I think people that want to stay in the military shouldn't get ripped. I mean, they should stay in. The talent that's going to leave in the next few years will be a danger for our national security. I think we need force levels that are higher, and the great capabilities that have been earned by this military needs to stay in place. The benefit structures have been improved, and I think that that's fantastic. There's a greater focus on the soft issues, so-called soft issues, and family issues, and there obviously more can be done. As it relates to veterans in general, the Veterans Administration's got a long way to go to be a modern, veterans-focused organization. 330,000 employees. The amount of money that is being spent has grown exponentially in the last few years. This is not money. This is a problem, internal problem of how you deliver services. As an example, veterans, one of the things that I think that veterans are deserving of are more choices.
They have some. There's only
They do. 30,000 vets have taken advantage of this choice program amongst millions that are qualified for 30,000, a tiny fraction. I think we ought to make that easier for veterans to be able to get, if they want to go to their private doctor, they ought to have that right to do it. Right now it's limited because you have to be 40 miles away from a veterans clinic or hospital, and you have to have had 30 days of not being able to get scheduled. The veterans in hospitals ought to have online scheduling. I mean, how many people have gone to see their doctor going online to get an appointment, just out of curiosity? 2 years from now, everybody will raise their hand, because information technology is changing how doctors and hospitals and clinics provide care. Veterans Department has no possibility of getting this right unless there's new leadership. So there's much that can be done to provide a more dignified way for veterans to access the benefits that they've earned.
I want to ask you about another nuclear power who we haven't discussed, and that's North Korea. What do you do about that?
I think we need to engage. One of the challenges that we face is a aggressive China, economically, now militarily, growing their military capabilities far faster than any other country, seeing American weakness and pushing forward, building a military base in the middle of the South China Sea is pretty extraordinary. 10 years ago, I would have never envisioned that happening. And so in this environment where China could play a really constructive role to deal with a huge threat, I mean, I would say the North Korean nuclear threat is as dangerous as Iran breaking out and having this capability, or Pakistan, turning into a failed state and having these
I've
capabilities.
heard this much about it. It's very simple.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
how do we handle it?
I think the structure of engagement with China, where we deal with the cybersecurity challenges, we deal with their threats, we deal with the economic challenges we face. We have to have we deal with the fact that they now, openly are trying to convince expatriates, Chinese expatriates, to come home, threatening them and their families. All this stuff we need to be fully engaged to make sure that we maintain some relationship with them, with the objective, one of many objectives, of having them recognize that this is in their security interests as well.
Very different attitude you're expressing towards Putin as opposed to Chinese. Of course, they're different situations. But
Yeah.
You're saying tough with Russia.
No, I think we need
You're
to-
saying engage with China.
We need to be-
Striking me there.
We need to engage with the Russian people. We should do everything we can to push Russia towards the West rather than away from us. That would create a much more stable world. But I believe that Putin personally responds to clarity, and he responds to the assurance that your word matters, that you're going to act on your word. I'm not talking about big talk and no action again. I think you can engage with Russia as well. There are ways to do that. But the Chinese relationship is going to be the dominant relationship because of their size, their emergence. The economy is growing. It's the second largest economy. They'll soon be the largest economy in the world. And we have to engage with them. It's an incredibly complicated relationship. And to answer your question, if Russia had some ability to hold sway over North Korea, I would figure out a way to get them engaged as well. In this particular case, the one country that has some influence over China wants to create a buffer. Let me go over North Korea. The Chinese want to create a buffer. They don't view it the same way we do, but the emergence of North Korea and their nuclear capabilities is just as much a threat to China as it is to the United States.
We have some time left. Do you want to give a few concluding remarks? Do you want to take more questions from the audience?
Yeah, we'll do more questions. You've been great. I've enjoyed this a lot. I hope that I have a chance to visit with people too, so whenever that's appropriate.
Let's get to a few more of these. Jessica asks, how do you plan on fostering closer relations with Eastern European countries? What do you believe will provide greater stability and safety?
Rewind the tape. First, I'll tell you how not to do it. Have a commitment for missile defense and radar capability in the Czech Republic and Poland. Yank it out from under them because you're trying to reset the relationship with Russia without any clear strategy to do so. That's it. On the eve of the Soviet invasion of Poland, I mean, talking about timing, that to our strongest ally, I think, in Europe, most consistent, strong ally. So engagement with Eastern Europe for them to know that we have their back is important. And I think some of the NATO forces that right now are in the western side of Europe need to be pushed to where they're desperately wanted, and that would be Poland and the Baltics. There's a specific thing that we could do is support this notion of a north-south corridor that goes from Poland down to Central Europe, where there's additional infrastructure that does not makes Eastern Europe particularly, but Europe in general, dependent upon Russian natural gas. We should expedite the permitting of LNG plants to have our natural gas be used as a foreign policy tool to create a more stable power market for Europe, so they're not dependent upon this. And that north-south corridor would be one of those ways that we can do that.
We have an NSA question. The NSA's mission statement is very broad. Justin asks, how can we trust that these circumstances won't be created to justify further surveillance? You've spoken very strongly today in support of the NSA.
I have, and I've asked many people, are there any cases, is there any evidence of civil liberties being violated? And I've not found one. Now, does that mean we shouldn't be vigilant about this? Clearly. I mean, this is an important national security conversation. We should be really vigilant about it, and we should protect people's privacy, and we ought to protect their freedoms in this country. But I would argue that that's why you need to have a strong NSA is to do just that. There's a place to find common ground between personal and civil liberties, and NSA doing its job.
And you
effectively.
think the balance is right now?